It was an ordinary afternoon at Joe's corner store, the kind of place where the shelves were always stocked with the same products, the aisles slightly narrow, and the air thick with the scent of cleaning supplies and stale coffee. It wasn't much, but to most people it was just a stop for a quick snack or a cold drink on the way home. Nothing ever seemed out of place. That is, until the Miller family walked in. Mark Miller, a man in his 30s with a weathered face and tired eyes, stepped through the door with his wife Lisa and their young daughter Emma. The family hadn't planned to go to Joe's corner store, but the situation was getting desperate. Mark had just come from his second job working long hours to make ends meet. Lisa, once a promising graphic designer, had lost her job months ago. The bills piled up and there never seemed to be enough money. Today they needed something simple, a loaf of bread, maybe a can of soup for dinner. A small purchase, but to them, it felt like a luxury. Lisa held Emma's hand, gently guiding her through the aisles, while Mark grabbed a loaf of bread and a few cans of soup from the shelf. They kept their heads down, trying to blend in. But they couldn't help it. Money was tight, and it showed. Mark's shoes were worn at the edges, Lisa's coat had seen better days, and Emma's dress was a hand-me-down from a neighbor. As they moved to the counter, the store owner, Mr. Thompson, was watching them closely from behind the register. He was a middle-aged man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, his glasses perched at the tip of his nose, like he was always sizing people up. He had a reputation for being cold and distant, a man who didn't smile unless it was forced. And today his eyes narrowed as he observed the Millers. "Is this all?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice blunt, almost accusatory. Mark nodded, trying to keep things casual. "Yes, just these." The store owner's gaze flicked over the items, bread, soup, nothing extravagant, and then back to Mark. A slow, calculating look passed over his face. He didn't like the way the Millers looked. The worn clothes, the way they seemed to be avoiding eye contact, he had seen it before. People who couldn't afford the luxury of shopping without guilt. It didn't sit well with him. Mr. Thompson leaned over the counter slightly, his voice dropping to a low, almost threatening tone. "You sure you can pay for all that?" he asked, staring directly at Mark. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, but the words didn't come. Mark, feeling the weight of the situation, gave a forced smile, trying to diffuse the tension. "Yes, sir. We've got the money." But Mr. Thompson wasn't having it. He looked at them for a long moment, almost as if he were inspecting their very souls. "I don't think you do," he muttered, his eyes cold. "Maybe you should leave." Lisa's face flushed with embarrassment, but Emma, confused, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Why do we have to leave, Mommy?" Mark opened his mouth to protest, but Mr. Thompson was already turning his back, busying himself with rearranging a stack of magazines as though nothing had happened. "Leave now," Mr. Thompson said, his voice final, "or I'll call the cops." Lisa felt her heart race. She could feel every eye in the store now turning toward them, though there was no one else around. It felt like the world had shrunk down to just this moment, this humiliating moment in front of her daughter. Mark grabbed Lisa's hand tightly, his voice shaking. "Let's go, Lisa. It's not worth it." And with that, they walked out. The sound of the bell above the door echoed behind them as they stepped into the cool afternoon air. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? The wind stung Lisa's cheeks as she stood outside Joe's corner store, her hands clenched around Emma's little hand, trying to steady herself. The world around them seemed indifferent to the storm they were navigating. The neon lights of nearby businesses flickered, but nothing felt warm or inviting anymore. Mark, walking silently beside her, looked defeated. His shoulders were hunched, the weight of everything pressing down on him. It had been a long time since he'd felt like he was getting ahead. Every step, every move felt like he was drowning in the weight of it all. He had been working tirelessly, at 2 jobs, both exhausting, both underpaid, and yet it never felt like it was enough. The bills piled up and they were always just one step away from falling behind. As they walked toward their old battered car, Emma's small voice broke the silence. "Mummy, so why didn't we buy the bread?" Her innocent question cut through the tension like a knife, and Lisa felt her stomach twist. How could she explain this to her little girl? How could she explain to Emma that the world wasn't always fair, that some people would judge them based on nothing more than appearances? "We're just having a tough time right now, sweetheart," Lisa said softly, kneeling down to Emma's level. "But we'll get through it. We always do." Mark opened the car door, his movements slow, mechanical. He slumped into the driver's seat, his eyes fixed on the empty road ahead. He didn't have the energy to comfort Emma, or even Lisa right now. The weight of being the provider, of constantly falling short, was suffocating. "Maybe we should have just taken the food anyway," Marky muttered under his breath, his words carrying a hint of bitterness. "It's just a loaf of bread and some soup. Why does he have to act like we're criminals?" Lisa slid into the passenger seat beside him, her hands resting on her lap. "You can't just take things, Mark. I know it feels unfair, but we have to keep our heads up. We're not those people." But deep down, Lisa knew that the unfairness of it all was eating at them both. The feeling of being invisible, the constant fear of being judged by others, and the desperate struggle to make it through each day. It was a cruel cycle. As Mark started the car, Emma quietly stared out the window. Her eyes were wide with confusion, her little heart unable to understand why things couldn't just be normal. Back inside Joe's corner store, Mr. Thompson had returned to his usual routine, but his mind wasn't on the stack of newspapers he was sorting through. He kept replaying the encounter with the Millers in his head. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that he had overstepped. It wasn't like him to be so blunt, but something about them, something about the way they looked, had set him off. Wiped his hands on his apron and glanced at the clock. The place was quiet as usual. No one seemed to care. But Mr. Thompson couldn't help but wonder. Were they really just a struggling family, or was there something else? Could he have been wrong? The guilt gnawed at him. He had seen families like them before, families who came in pretending to be fine but really struggling. Was he too quick to judge? He thought about the way the wife had looked, her eyes a mix of embarrassment and frustration, and the little girl's confused face. It felt wrong now, the way he had dismissed them. Meanwhile, Lisa and Mark were driving in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the air. They passed the familiar landmarks, the old park where they used to take Emma to play, the gas station where Mark once worked, and Lisa's mind wandered to a time when things had been better. She thought about the days when they would have lazy Sunday mornings making pancakes for breakfast, and how Emma would run around the house, laughing and pretending to be a superhero. Those days felt so far away now, like they belonged to a different lifetime. Mark took a deep breath, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "We can't keep going like this," he said quietly. "I don't know what to do anymore. Every time I think things might get better, they don't." Lisa reached over and placed a hand on his. "We'll figure it out, Mark. We always do. We just need to keep going, even when it feels like we're stuck." Emma turned her head from the window, her soft voice cutting through the tension. "When I grow up, I'm going to help people, like Keanu Reeves." Lisa and Mark both blinked, momentarily startled. "Keanu Reeves," Mark repeated, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah." Emma's eyes lit up. "He's a nice man. I saw him on TV. He helps people and he's really kind." Lisa chuckled, her heart swelling with a strange warmth. "You're right, sweetie. He's one of the good ones." Mark gave a small laugh, though it was more out of habit than humor. "Yeah, maybe one day we'll meet him." But even as the conversation shifted, Lisa couldn't shake the nagging feeling of embarrassment that lingered from the store. She wished there was more she could do, more she could give, but the road ahead was hard to see. It was another ordinary day for Keanu Reeves, at least in the sense that he had just wrapped up a few meetings and was grabbing a snack from Joe's corner store before heading to his next stop. Despite his fame, Keanu liked to keep things simple. The small, no-frills convenience store had become his go-to place whenever he was in the area. There was something about the old, familiar feel of it that made him feel at home. As he stepped out of his black sports car, the bell above the store's door jingled softly. He smiled to himself. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It was the kind of place where no one cared who you were, which Keanu appreciated. Today, he was just another guy walking in to buy a snack. Inside, the store had the usual slightly cramped feel. Rows of chips, candy, canned goods and drinks lined the shelves. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, adding to the low-key vibe. Keanu made his way toward the snack aisle, casually scanning the shelves for something to munch on. But something was off today. As Keanu walked past the counter, he noticed a family standing outside the store, just beyond the glass door. A man and a woman looking down at the ground, their young daughter holding her mother's hand. The look on their faces was hard to miss. Defeat, frustration, maybe even a little bit of embarrassment. Keanu frowned and paused for a moment, his eyes lingering on them. He wasn't sure why, but something about the family caught his attention. The little girl Emma had her hand pressed against the window, staring at a candy bar on the shelf inside. Keanu could feel her longing from across the street, and it stirred something deep within him. Before he could think twice, Keanu moved toward the door and held it open for the family. As they walked in, he smiled, though it was clear that the mood had shifted the moment they crossed the threshold. The man, Mark, seemed to tense up, while the woman, Lisa, kept her eyes down. Emma, however, brightened when she noticed the candy bar. Keanu took a breath and stepped forward. "Hi there," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "I couldn't help but notice you guys outside. Everything all right?" Lisa and Mark both looked at him surprised. They didn't recognize him immediately, though Keanu's friendly demeanor and the kindness in his eyes quickly put them at ease. Mark, still guarded, gave a small nod. "Yeah, just a rough day, I guess." Keanu gave a slight chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. "I hear you, I've had plenty of those." Lisa smiled weakly, grateful for the kindness, but still feeling the weight of the awkward situation. "Thank you," she said softly. Mark cleared his throat and adjusted the items in his hands. "We were just about to leave. Didn't have enough, you know." Keanu nodded, understanding the unspoken words. He could feel the tension, the embarrassment in the air. He looked at Emma, who was still eyeing the candy bar longingly, her eyes wide with hope. Without missing a beat, Keanu turned to the cashier, Mr. Thompson, who was busy organizing a stack of chips behind the counter. "I'll take care of their groceries," he said casually, pulling out his wallet. "Put it on my tab, will you?" Mr. Thompson looked at him, unblinking, before his gaze flickered to the family. For a split second, the store owner hesitated. His earlier judgment of the Millers came rushing back, but something in Keanu's presence made him pause. The store owner didn't say a word, just nodded stiffly. Keanu turned back to the family, who were now looking at him with a mix of confusion and gratitude. "Don't worry about it. You guys are good," Keanu said with a reassuring smile. "Consider it a little help from a stranger who knows what it's like to need a break." Lisa's eyes widened as she took in the gesture. "But we don't want to—" "No strings attached," Keanu interrupted gently. "I just wanted to help." Mark looked at him for a moment longer, as if trying to read his face. He was used to being suspicious of help from strangers, especially with how hard life had been recently. But there was something about Keanu, something real, that made it hard to say no. Emma's face lit up when Keanu pulled a candy bar from the shelf and handed it to her. "Here you go, young lady. Enjoy." Emma's eyes were wide with wonder as she clutched the candy bar. "Thank you," Keanu ruffled her hair playfully. "Any time, kiddo." There was a pause, and then Mark sighed, his shoulders relaxing just a little. "I don't know how to say thank you. This is just—" "Don't worry about it," Keanu said, waving a hand. "Sometimes life just gives you a little reminder that things can get better." Mark nodded, his voice cracking a bit. "It's hard, you—" "No. You try and it feels like you're always one step behind." Keanu's expression softened. "I know. Trust me, I know." His voice became quieter, more reflective. "But don't give up. You've got this." The family was quiet for a moment, taking in his words. It was strange, this interaction. A simple moment in a convenience store, but it felt like more. Keanu's kindness had brought them a little light on a dark day. As they gathered their things, Keanu gave one last smile. "Take care, okay? And don't forget, help is out there when you least expect it." And with that, Keanu turned to leave. He could hear Mr. Thompson behind the counter now speaking in a low voice to the family, but it didn't matter. For Keanu, the encounter was just another reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness made the biggest difference. The Millers were quiet as they walked out of Joe's corner store. Mark still couldn't fully wrap his mind around what had just happened. One moment, they were standing at the counter, humiliated and unsure how they were going to make it through the day. The next moment, a man, Keanu Reeves no less, had stepped in and paid for their groceries, no questions asked. The air outside felt cooler now, and the evening sky was starting to darken. The usual hum of the city faded into the background, and for a moment it was as if the world had stopped spinning just for them. Lisa clutched the bag with their groceries, her fingers tightening around it, as if she were afraid it might slip away. She glanced down at Emma, who was happily clutching the candy bar in both hands, her wide eyes sparkling with excitement. The child had no idea of the weight that had just been lifted off her parents' shoulders. "Mum, can I eat it now?" Emma asked, her voice full of innocence and excitement. Lisa smiled softly, ruffling her daughter's hair. "Sure, sweetie. Go ahead." Mark exhaled deeply, trying to shake off the confusion swirling in his head. He had never been one to accept charity, let alone from someone as famous as Keanu Reeves. He had always prided himself on working hard and taking care of his family. But today, in that store, Keanu had given them something they hadn't had in a long time. Hope. Hope that maybe things could get better, that there were still good people out there, people who cared when life seemed to be stacked against you. "Do you think he'll ever know how much this means to us?" Lisa asked quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. Mark looked at her, his eyes softer now than they had been earlier. "I think he already knows. I think that's why he did it." They walked in silence for a few more moments before Mark spoke again. "I guess maybe we do need a little help sometimes, huh?" Lisa smiled, squeezing his hand. "We all do, Mark, we all do." As they neared their car, Emma happily unwrapped the candy bar, her tiny hands fumbling with the plastic wrapper. "Thank you, Mommy and Daddy," she said between bites. "This is the best day ever." Mark laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're welcome, kiddo, but remember, we don't need candy to make a good day." Emma's face lit up. "But it helps." She giggled. Lisa laughed too, her heart lifting just a little more with the sound of Emma's pure joy. Maybe it wasn't the whole world, but at least for now they had each other, and sometimes that was enough. Back inside Joe's corner store, Mr. Thompson stood behind the counter, still watching the Millers through the front window as they climbed into their car and drove off. He felt a strange gnawing sensation in his stomach, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. He had seen so many families like them, struggling, just trying to get by, and he'd always kept his distance. He told himself it was none of his business. But today, seeing Keanu's unassuming kindness toward them had changed something inside him. He couldn't just pretend it didn't matter anymore. Mr. Thompson wiped his hands on his apron and looked around the store, as if seeing it through new eyes. It was a small store, but it was his, and it was all he had. He had always kept a wall up between himself and the world, but Keanu's actions had reminded him that maybe he needed to let that wall down, just a little. The bell above the door jingled as a new customer entered, snapping him out of his thoughts. He put on his usual mask, the indifferent store owner, and greeted the customer with his usual gruff tone. But in the back of his mind, he was still thinking about the Millers, about how one small act of kindness had affected them, how it had made their day a little better. Maybe he too could do something like that. Maybe he too could make a difference. As the Millers drove home, they talked little, but felt a shared understanding. The weight that had been pressing on their hearts for months, the constant fear and exhaustion from their financial struggles, felt a little lighter. It wasn't all fixed. It wasn't even close. But for the first time in a long while, they felt like they might be able to breathe again. Mark turned onto their street and parked the car in the driveway. As they got out, Emma skipped toward the front door, still munching happily on her candy. "Maybe things will be okay," Mark murmured, mostly to himself. Lisa nodded, looking up at the sky, the stars beginning to appear. Maybe, Inside, Emma ran to her room to put down her things, still humming her little tune as she danced through the house. Lisa and Mark sat at the kitchen table, the grocery bag between them. They hadn't said it aloud, but they both knew that things were hard. That life wasn't fair, and that sometimes the struggle felt like too much, but today there had been a shift. A glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, everything wouldn't be as difficult as they feared. Maybe there was something more waiting for them in the future. The next morning, the sun rose with the same familiar brightness, but for Lisa and Mark, everything felt just a little different. The events of the previous day, the kindness from Keanu Reeves, the moment of unexpected relief, had given them something they hadn't realized they were missing, a sense of possibility. For the first time in weeks, Mark woke up without the crushing weight of worry sitting heavily on his chest. He stretched as he sat on the edge of the bed looking at Lisa, who was already getting up to start the day. Her expression was softer too, as if something inside her had shifted overnight. The tension between them was gone, replaced by a tentative but growing hope. "Morning," Lisa said with a small, sleepy smile as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Mark smiled back. "Morning. We okay?" She nodded. "I think so. I don't know what Keanu saw in us yesterday, but it made me feel like we might actually be okay. Like maybe there's more good out there than we think." Mark didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about how much they'd struggled to make ends meet. But Lisa was right. Keanu's simple act of kindness had planted a seed of something bigger. They had been so focused on surviving the day-to-day, they'd almost forgotten that life could hold more than just getting by. Mark stood and walked over to the window, looking out at their small yard. "I've been thinking a lot about what Keanu said. About not giving up," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of his thoughts. "Maybe it's time we stop just surviving and start actually living again." Lisa raised an eyebrow, setting down her cup. "What do you mean?" Mark turned back to her, his face determined. "I've been holding on to this job, this old routine, for too long. It's not working, and I'm not sure it ever will. Maybe it's time I look for something new, something that might give us a real shot." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped for this moment, but hearing Mark say it out loud was something else entirely. It was like hearing the door to a new life creak open just a little bit. "So you're serious?" she asked, almost whispering. "Yeah," Mark said firmly. "It's scary as hell, but I think it's time to take a risk. We need to stop waiting for life to give us a break and go out and make one ourselves. I've got to start. Somewhere. Maybe that's the change we need." Lisa walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his arm. "I think you're right. We've been afraid to make a change for so long, but maybe now's the time." Emma, who had been quietly watching from the doorway, suddenly bounded into the kitchen, her small voice cutting through the conversation. "What are we talking about?" she asked, her big brown eyes full of curiosity. Lisa and Mark exchanged a quick glance before Mark crouched down to her level. "We're talking about making things better for us, sweetheart, about finding a way to live the way we really want to." Emma smiled brightly, her innocence a sharp contrast to the heaviness that had once hung over the family. "So that sounds fun. Can we have pancakes?" Lisa laughed softly and ruffled Emma's hair. "We'll see, kiddo, but you're right, it's about finding a way to make things better." Later that afternoon, after Mark had sent out a few resumes and looked into local opportunities, he sat down at the kitchen table, feeling a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. He wasn't sure what kind of job he was looking for, but he knew he needed to find something that would lift the weight off his shoulders. The jobs he had been working were draining him physically and emotionally. They weren't going to provide the future he dreamed of for his family. His phone buzzed, a new email. Mark opened it, his eyes scanning quickly until he saw the subject line. "Opportunity in your area. Business management position." He stared at the screen for a moment, a spark of excitement flaring in his chest. It was a long shot. He had no experience in business management, but something about the position felt right. It was more than just a job, it was a chance at a career. A chance for the family to have stability, a future that didn't feel like a constant struggle. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether he should apply. It was one thing to think about change, but it was another to actually take that first step into the unknown. Across town, Keanu was finishing up a meeting. His day had been filled with the usual hustle of his career, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the Millers. He wasn't one to follow up on his acts of kindness, but something about their story had stayed with him. The look on Lisa's face, the way Mark had seemed so hesitant to accept help. It reminded him of a time in his life when he had felt just as lost, just as unsure of how to keep going. As he left the meeting, he checked his phone and saw a message from a friend who was helping to run a charity event later that week. His mind immediately went to the Millers. What if they needed something more? What if this small gesture could turn into something that could change their lives for good? He texted his friend, "Do you have any local opportunities for families who could use a hand? I met a family recently, and I think they could use some support." Keanu wasn't sure exactly what he could do for them, but he was determined to help however he could. After all, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could set off a chain reaction, one that could change everything. Back at the Miller's house, the evening sun cast a golden glow over the yard as Lisa and Mark sat together on the porch, a sense of quiet contentment settling between them. Emma was playing in the grass, her laughter filling the air. The weight of the world no longer felt quite so heavy. "We'll figure this out," Mark said, his voice calm but determined. "I can feel it. Things are changing." Lisa smiled, watching Emma run across the yard. "Yeah," she agreed softly. "Things are changing." As the days passed, the Millers continued to feel the subtle but undeniable shift in their lives. Mark had thrown himself into job applications with a newfound determination, and Lisa, although still worried about their financial situation, found herself looking forward to the future in a way she hadn't in years. The feeling that they were finally taking control of their lives was invigorating, even if it was terrifying at times. One morning, Mark sat down with a steaming cup of coffee and opened his laptop. The job search had been exhausting, but today something felt different. He had been applying to everything from management positions to entry-level roles, trying to find the right fit. But today there was something he hadn't noticed before, a listing for a small local business looking for a general manager with no prior experience required. Mark rubbed his eyes rereading the description. It seemed too good to be true, but then just as quickly doubt crept in. "What if it's a scam?" Mark muttered to himself. "What if I mess up again?" Lisa, walking into the room with her usual morning calm, heard him. "What's going on?" she asked, setting down a plate of toast. He gestured toward the screen. "I don't know, Lisa. It's a business management job, but I don't have any experience in that field. It feels like a stretch." She sat beside him, looking at the listing. "But it says no experience is needed," she pointed out. "Maybe this is the one. Maybe this is your shot." Mark hesitated. His mind was telling him it was risky, but his heart, the part of him that had been pushed down for so long, felt something. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was faith. "You really think I should apply?" "I think you should at least try," she said, squeezing his hand. "You've got nothing to lose and everything to gain." Mark took a deep breath and clicked apply. Across town, Keanu's actions had set something in motion. His simple text to a friend about the Millers' situation had snowballed. It had begun as a casual mention, but had quickly turned into an opportunity for him to do more. A friend from their local charity network had reached out, asking if Keanu had any suggestions for families who could use a little extra help. Keanu, with his heart always in the right place, immediately thought of the Millers. He had arranged for them to be part of a community outreach event later that month, where they would receive some assistance with rent, groceries, and a few other necessities. Keanu made it clear to his friend that he wanted to remain anonymous in helping them, just as he had in the store. He believed in the power of small acts of kindness, the kind that didn't need recognition or a pat on the back. But Keanu also knew something else. The ripple effect of his actions might just change their lives in a bigger way than anyone could anticipate. That afternoon, the Millers received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from the same local charity that Keanu had reached out to. Lisa opened the envelope cautiously, her eyes scanning the page. The letter was short and to the point. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Miller, we are writing to inform you that your family has been selected to receive assistance through our community outreach program. We understand that times have been tough, and we would like to offer support in the form of rent relief, groceries, and other essentials. We hope this will ease some of the pressure during this difficult time. A representative will contact you shortly to discuss the next steps. Warm regards, the community. Outreach team Lisa's hands trembled as she read the letter. She blinked twice, unsure if she was reading it right. Rent relief? Groceries? She turned to Mark, who had been watching her with anticipation. Mark, it's real. This is real. Mark stood up and walked over to her. He took the letter from her hand and read it himself, feeling the lump in his throat grow. For a moment he couldn't speak. Everything seemed so surreal. They hadn't even asked for help. They had simply tried to keep their heads above water, but somehow the world had decided to give them a break. Is this because of Keanu? Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded slowly. It has to be. It makes sense now. The timing. Everything. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for the Millers. Mark received a call from the business offering him an interview. Despite his nerves, he was determined to make the most of it. The chance to change his life and his family's was too good to pass up. And the charity support? That helped more than they could have imagined. Their rent was covered for the next few months, and the groceries and essentials that were delivered gave them room to breathe. It wasn't a solution to all their problems, but it was the first step toward stability, and it felt like the universe was finally aligning in their favor. Meanwhile, Keanu went on with his life, unaware of the exact impact he'd had on the Millers. He continued his charitable work, his career, and his routine, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder how they were doing. Had they found the hope they needed? The universe, it seemed, had a way of bringing people together at exactly the right moment. The day of the interview came, and Mark put on his best suit, a suit that had been tucked away in the back of the closet for far too long. Lisa gave him a reassuring smile as he looked into the mirror. You've got this. You're ready. With one last look at his family, Mark stepped out the door. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he was filled with something that had been absent for far too long. Hope. Mark arrived at the business for his interview, his palms sweaty despite the cool morning air. He had put on his best suit, a crisp navy blue jacket and pressed slacks, though it felt a bit too tight around his waist. The nerves were starting to creep in, and he couldn't help but think of all the what-ifs swirling in his mind. What if they didn't like him? What if he wasn't good enough? He tried to calm his racing thoughts, but the uncertainty still hung over him like a heavy cloud. He walked into the building, the lobby sleek and modern, a sharp contrast to the cluttered atmosphere of Joe's corner store, where he had spent years working. He tried to ignore the anxious butterflies fluttering in his stomach as he made his way to the reception desk. Hello, I'm Mark Miller. I'm here for the business management interview, he said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly smile, looked up from her computer. Mr. Miller, we've been expecting you. Please take a seat and someone will be with you shortly. Mark nodded and sat down in the sleek leather chair, his hands resting on his lap. The lobby was quiet except for the sound of soft music playing in the background and the tapping of keys from other employees working in the open office area behind the reception desk. After what seemed like an eternity, a man in his mid-40s emerged from the hallway, a warm smile on his face. Mr. Miller, he asked, extending his hand. I'm Greg Lawson, the hiring manager. It's a pleasure to meet you. Mark shook his hand, feeling a bit of relief as the man's friendly demeanor immediately put him at ease. Nice to meet you, Mr. Lawson. Please call me Greg, he said, leading Mark into the interview room. As they sat across from each other, Greg opened a folder and looked at Mark's resume. So, Mark, I see you don't have a traditional business background, but your experience in customer service and retail is impressive. I'm curious, why do you think you'd be a good fit for a management role here? Mark cleared his throat, trying to organize his thoughts. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, he felt the weight of the question. I've spent years working in retail, and through that, I've learned the value of hard work, adaptability, and managing relationships. I know how to keep things running smoothly even when it feels like everything is falling apart, and I'm not afraid to learn new things. If given the opportunity, I'm confident I can bring a fresh perspective to your team. Greg nodded thoughtfully, jotting down a few notes. I like that, he said. It sounds like you've got the right mindset. But let's talk a little more about leadership. Have you ever been in charge of a team or managed others before? Mark hesitated for a moment. Not officially, no, but I've always tried to lead by example, especially when things get tough. I'm the type of person who steps up when needed, even if it's not in my job description. Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Tell me about a time you had to step up in a tough situation. Mark thought back to the countless times he had managed difficult situations, both at the store and at home. There was one moment in particular that stood out. The time he had been forced to step in when Joe had failed to show up for a shift, leaving the store in disarray. One time my boss was out sick, and I had to manage the store alone for a day. We were short-staffed and there were a lot of upset customers. I had to keep everything running smoothly while making sure everyone left satisfied. It was stressful, but I handled it by staying calm, communicating clearly with my team and doing everything I could to keep the customers happy. In the end, we made it through the day without any major issues. I learned that leadership isn't just about being in charge. It's about knowing when to step in and when to let others shine. Greg smiled. That's exactly the kind of mindset we're looking for. You may not have the formal business experience we typically look for, but it sounds like you've got the qualities that matter most: grit, adaptability, and a willingness to learn. Mark felt a surge of relief. I really appreciate that. I'm willing to put in the work, Greg. I just need the chance. Greg leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. You're definitely someone we'd like to get to know better. We have a few more candidates to interview, but we'll be making a decision soon. You'll hear from us by the end of the week. Mark nodded, standing up to shake Greg's hand once again. Thank you for your time, Greg. I really appreciate the opportunity. As he walked out of the building, Mark's heart was pounding in his chest. But this time it wasn't out of fear, it was excitement. He had done it. He had put himself out there and he had given it his best shot. Now it was a waiting game. That evening Mark returned home, feeling a mixture of hope and exhaustion. He walked through the door, greeted by the sound of Emma's laughter as she played with her toys on the floor. How was it? Lisa asked, her eyes hopeful. It went well, Mark replied with a smile, though his nerves were still buzzing. Better than I thought it would. Lisa's face lit up. I knew you could do it. How do you feel? Mark thought for a moment before responding. I feel hopeful, nervous, but hopeful. It's the best I've felt in a long time. Just then, Mark's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, expecting to see a text from his mom or a friend, but when he unlocked the screen, he saw an unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment, then answered the call. Hello? Hi, is this Mark Miller? A voice on the other end asked. Yes, this is Mark, he replied, his heart pounding again. This is Greg Lawson from the company you interviewed with, the voice continued. I wanted to personally let you know that we were very impressed with your interview, and we'd like to offer you the position of general manager. Congratulations, Mark. Mark's jaw dropped, and for a few seconds he could barely find his words. Wait, you're offering me the job? Yes, we are, Greg confirmed. We believe you're the right person for the role. We'll send you the details in the next couple of days. Welcome aboard. Mark couldn't help but let out a laugh of disbelief, his eyes welling up with emotion. Thank you so much. As he hung up the phone, he turned to Lisa, who was standing there, wide-eyed. They offered me the job, he said, barely able to contain his excitement. Lisa's face broke into a smile so bright it lit up the entire room. Oh my God, Mark, that's amazing. Emma, hearing the excitement in her parents' voices, ran over. What's going on? Mark bent down to her level and wrapped her in a hug. We got good news, kiddo. Daddy's got a new job. Emma squealed with delight, wrapping her arms around her father's neck. That's awesome, Daddy. Lisa pulled Mark into a tight embrace, holding him as if she never wanted to let go. We did it, she whispered. And in that moment, Mark realized that they hadn't just gotten the job. This was the turning point. They were no longer just surviving. They were starting to live. The first few weeks at the new job were a whirlwind for Mark. The transition from his old life at Joe's corner store to a position as general manager of a growing business wasn't easy, but it was everything he had hoped for. The challenges were there: managing a team, learning the ins and outs of business operations, and facing the expectations that came with such a role. But Mark felt more alive than he had in years. He was no longer trapped in a cycle of day-to-day survival. He was building something, growing and learning at every turn. Still, it wasn't all smooth sailing. On his first big project, he was tasked with organizing an important event for the company's new product launch. The stakes were high. The company had poured a lot of resources into this event, and the pressure was mounting. Mark found himself staying late at the office, reviewing spreadsheets, coordinating with vendors, and making sure every detail was covered. The sleepless nights began to take their toll, and slowly, the balance he had worked so hard to achieve in his personal life started to slip. Lisa noticed the change immediately. Mark had always been a hard worker, but now it seemed like he was working constantly. He would come home late, too exhausted to do anything but eat and fall into bed. Weekends, once reserved for family outings, were now spent on the couch, his laptop open in front of him. "Mark," Lisa said one evening, as she watched him absent-mindedly scroll through his emails. "We need to talk." He looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" "It's not just about the job," Lisa began gently. "I get that this is important, but it feels like you're slipping away from us. You're not here with Emma and me anymore. We miss you." Mark paused, guilt washing over him. "I know, Lisa. I'm sorry. I want to make sure I do this right. I don't want to mess this up. I can't afford to." She reached out, placing her hand on his. "I get that. I do. But you have to remember what you're doing this for. We're all here and we need you. Not just the success, but you, the real you. Don't lose sight of that." Mark looked down at her hand on his, her words sinking in. She was right. He had been so focused on proving himself, on securing their future, that he had forgotten the most important part: being present for the people who mattered most. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise I'll do better. I'll find a balance. I won't let this job take over everything." The next day, Mark walked into the office with a new sense of purpose. He had a long talk with his team, acknowledging the hard work they had been putting in, but also reminding them that there was more to life than just work. He knew that leading a team meant not only guiding them through the tough times, but also setting an example of balance and self-care. It wasn't an overnight fix, but the small changes he made had a ripple effect. He started delegating tasks more, trusting his team to take ownership of the event. He set clearer boundaries, refusing to bring work home on weekends and making sure he spent quality time with Lisa and Emma. Slowly but surely, he began to reclaim his life outside of work. Lisa noticed the shift almost immediately. "You're back," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, Emma playing in the yard. "It's good to see you again." Mark smiled, the weight of the past few weeks lifting off his shoulders. "I'm sorry for everything. I've been so focused on what I thought was important, I almost lost sight of what really matters." Lisa leaned in, kissing him softly on the cheek. "We're all in this together, Mark. We're your team too. Don't forget that." Meanwhile, the ripple effect of Mark's success continued to spread, even beyond the business world. The charity that had helped the Millers in their time of need had reached out to offer them additional support. The financial assistance had given them a foothold, but the real help came in the form of connections, mentors who had been through similar struggles and were now eager to lend a hand. Lisa had been invited to a community meeting where she met a woman who had successfully started her own small business. The woman had offered her advice, guidance, and even a potential partnership in the future. The Millers had come a long way from the days of struggling to make ends meet. Mark's success had opened doors, and the opportunities that once felt out of reach were now right in front of them. But as much as the Millers had gained, they had also learned valuable lessons along the way. One afternoon, as Mark walked home from work, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. The world was full of surprises, some that were harsh and others that were beautiful. When he had first met Keanu, it had felt like a twist of fate, an odd but meaningful encounter. Now looking back, Mark saw how everything had fallen into place, how the kindness of a stranger had set off a chain of events that had changed his family's life. He thought back to that moment in the convenience store, when he had felt humiliated, desperate, and powerless. He had been at his lowest, unsure of how he would keep his family afloat. But then Keanu had stepped in, not out of obligation, but because he saw something in Mark that he hadn't seen in himself. And that act of kindness had sparked the chain of events that had turned their lives around. It was more than just a job. It was more than just money. It was the realization that people, no matter how famous or ordinary, had the power to make a difference. Mark was no longer just a man struggling to survive. He was part of something bigger, something that transcended money and status. That evening, Mark sat down with his family to dinner, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly present. Emma laughed as she told stories from school, and Lisa smiled as she watched them, the warmth of the moment sinking into their hearts. There was no place he would rather be. Later that night, Mark found himself lying awake in bed, thinking about everything that had happened. It had been a long road full of twists and turns, but as he looked at his family, he knew that they were stronger than ever. They had weathered the storm, and now they were on their way to something better. And just as he was about to drift off to sleep, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Mark reached over and picked it up, surprised to see a message from an unfamiliar number. "Hey Mark, it's Keanu. I just wanted to check in. How's everything going?" Mark smiled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through him. He typed back, "Hey Keanu, it's going great thanks to you. I just wanted to say thanks again. You really changed our lives." He paused for a moment, then added, "Sometimes it's the small things that make all the difference." The phone buzzed a few seconds later with Keanu's reply, "I'm just glad I could help. Take care, Mark. You've got this." And in that moment, Mark knew he was right. The weeks flew by as Mark adjusted to his new routine, finding a balance between work and family life. It wasn't always easy, but he had learned to prioritize what mattered most: his wife, his daughter, and the pursuit of something meaningful, not just financially, but emotionally and mentally. Every now and then, he would think back to that pivotal moment at the convenience store when Keanu Reeves had stepped in, offering help when Mark had felt like he was at his lowest. He had no idea how much that act of kindness would alter the course of his life. Keanu's message had stayed with him, a reminder that small gestures could lead to extraordinary change. Mark knew he wasn't the only one to benefit from this type of unexpected kindness, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the ripple effect it had created. He was now part of a bigger story, one that involved not just his family, but a growing community of people who were committed to supporting each other. One afternoon, Mark received an invitation that surprised him, an event hosted by the charity that had helped his family when things were tough. The organization was celebrating its anniversary, and they wanted to honor Mark's journey and how his success had come full circle. They also invited Keanu to the event, as they recognized how his intervention had helped set everything in motion. Mark felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as the day approached. He wasn't one for public recognition, but he knew how important this event was, not just for him, but for everyone involved. It was a chance to show the community how interconnected their lives were, how one small act could make a world of difference. The event took place at a large, elegant venue. When Mark and Lisa arrived, the space was filled with people from all walks of life, volunteers, donors, and families who had been helped by the organization. It was humbling to see so many people who had come together for a common cause, each with their own story of struggle and triumph. Lisa gave Mark a gentle nudge. "This is it. Your moment." Mark smiled and squeezed her hand, feeling the familiar rush of nerves. But this time, it wasn't the anxious, stomach-churning kind of nerves. It was the kind that came from being proud of how far they had come, and of the people who had helped them along the way. Soon the crowd was gathered in the main hall, and Mark stood at the front with the organization's leaders. The host, a kind woman named Sarah, stepped up to the microphone and began to speak. "Tonight, We gather not just to celebrate the achievements of this organization, but to celebrate the spirit of community, resilience, and kindness. Many of you here have shared your stories of overcoming adversity, and together we've all made a lasting impact. But tonight, we also want to honor one family in particular, the Millers, whose journey embodies everything we stand for. There was a round of applause, and Mark's heart swelled with emotion. Lisa stood proudly beside him, Emma bouncing excitedly at their feet. "Mark," Sarah continued, "when you reached out for help, we knew we had a chance to make a difference in your life. What we didn't know was how much you would make a difference in ours. Your story, your dedication, and the way you've turned your life around has inspired so many people here tonight." Mark swallowed hard. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, but he knew it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had helped him along the way. He could never have done it alone. "We'd also like to acknowledge someone very special who played a crucial role in getting Mark here." "Tonight," Sarah said, smiling. "Keanu, would you please join us?" The room fell silent as Keanu walked up to the stage, his presence instantly recognizable. He gave a warm smile as he stood beside Mark, shaking his hand. "Keanu," Sarah said, "we all know how much your kindness has impacted Mark's life. Your willingness to step in and help at just the right moment has set this entire journey in motion. We can't thank you enough." Keanu gave a modest shrug, clearly humbled by the attention. "I was just in the right place at the right time. I'm just glad I could help. But Mark is the one who did all the hard work. He's the one who turned things around for himself and his family." The crowd applauded again, and Mark could feel the warmth of their support, but his mind was buzzing with thoughts of how far he had come. There were so many moments where he had thought he couldn't go on, that he would never find his way out of the darkness. But now here he was, standing in front of a room full of people who had helped him find his light. As the applause died down, Mark took the microphone, his hands shaking slightly. "Thank you all," he began, his voice steady, but emotional. "I can't tell you what this means to me and my family. I'll be honest, there were times when I thought everything was lost. But the truth is, I didn't get here on my own. I had help, Keanu's kindness, the support from this organization, my wife Lisa, who never stopped believing in me, and now this community. You all are the reason I'm standing here today." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces of people who had all been part of this journey. "I want everyone to know that no matter how hard things get, no matter how hopeless it may seem, there's always a way forward. And sometimes all it takes is one person, one moment of kindness, to change everything." The room was silent for a moment, before the applause erupted louder than before. Mark felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't try to stop them. This moment, this recognition, wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever felt forgotten, lost, or out of options. It was proof that change was possible, that the world could still be full of kindness, and that every single person mattered. After the ceremony, the Millers, along with Keanu, mingled with the guests. Lisa and Emma chatted with other families, while Mark took a moment to talk with Keanu. "Keanu, I don't even know how to thank you," Mark said, his voice filled with gratitude. Keanu smiled, his eyes warm. "You already have, Mark. By being here, by turning your life around, you're already showing how powerful one person's actions can be. You didn't just get a second chance, you've made a difference in so many lives already." Mark nodded, understanding the truth of his words. He had been given a second chance, but it wasn't just about him. It was about paying it forward, spreading kindness, and helping others in whatever way he could. And as he looked around the room at all the people who had come together to support him and his family, Mark knew one thing for sure. The journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What act of kindness has changed your life?